Galactic Council begged when Earth gutted their invasion force. She set the chip on the table and did not speak. The Accord plenary chamber was 430 years old, designed by civilizations that built for gravity they no longer felt, and the Earth delegate had just placed a single data chip, old format, archival class, scarred from 214 years of handling, at the center of the dais surface and folded her hands over it. No documents. No legal team arrayed behind her. No display cued. Just the chip in her hands and the silence she was apparently comfortable with. Kale Vorath noticed the chip before the delegates did. He noticed it the way he noticed most things in this chamber, from his station at the archival desk, 3 meters off the main floor, positioned where the Accord's rules required him to be. Close enough to document, far enough to be invisible. 13 months into his first assignment. Junior enough that no delegation had ever looked directly at him. Senior enough to know what old format archival storage looked like and what it required to be read. The chip was the kind used for long-term preservation, the kind rated for 3 centuries, the kind that needed a legacy reader, and the chamber had no legacy reader visible anywhere in its equipment array. No objection from the floor, no motion to table, no voice. The Earth delegate did not move. Several delegates looked up from their secondary materials. Presiding Officer Yalaseth, a Chandri elder who had been running these sessions for 19 years with the practiced efficiency of someone managing a trained schedule, glanced at the dais, and then at his session notes, and then back at the dais. The session record would show that Captain Ren Vassar, Ret, was granted permission to address the chamber at 0914 Standard Time, on Item 6 of 11, in the matter of the Vorath Hegemony's procedural dissolution of the Treaty of Keth-Saron, filed under Procedural Annex 7 Theta, 17 months prior. What the session record would not show, not in the official version at least, was the moment Kale understood that something in the architecture of this room was about to be turned against itself. She began to reach into her bag. Stay close. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 31 seconds? I have never been able to explain it to anyone who wasn't in the room. 3 years earlier, Kale had applied to the Archival Corps because he believed documentation was neutral. He had been told this explicitly during the intake process. The archivist does not interpret, does not advocate, does not choose what survives. The archivist records. What is true is what the record shows. He had believed this completely. 17 months before the session, a dissolution filing had moved through the Accord's procedural system, the way most dissolution filings did, quietly, efficiently, in a location where most delegations never looked. The Vorath Hegemony had filed under Procedural Annex 7 Theta, a secondary registry used for territorial reclassification surveys, in a section of the Accord's administrative structure that no Earth delegation had ever been given access to. The document was 3 pages. It dissolved the Treaty of Keth-Saron, a 212-year compact guaranteeing Earth's atmospheric sovereignty. The stated grounds were territorial reclassification under updated survey parameters. Kale had read it, filed it, and logged it as Item 6 of 11 on the agenda of the Accord's next available plenary review session, which was the session now taking place. His first week on station, he had logged 43 similar filings. He had flagged none of them for review. What the Keth-Saron dissolution meant, in practical terms, was this. The Vorath Hegemony was now legally permitted, under its own reading of the Accord Charter, to conduct atmospheric dispersal experiments within Earth's upper atmosphere. They had done so twice in the 16 months since the filing. The compounds used were described in the Hegemony's own reports as biologically inert to carbon-based life. Earth's scientific community had disputed this. The dispute had been logged. It lived in the margins of the official record, which is where all inconvenient things eventually waited. The Accord Council had reviewed the filing, noted the dispute, and taken no action. This was not hostility. Kale had come to understand, in 13 months of watching 41 delegations manage their own priorities, that hostility required energy. What the Council had shown toward Earth was something more efficient: indifference. Of the 41 delegations present that morning, 3 were reviewing secondary materials. 1 appeared to be asleep. Yalaseth had expected, Kale suspected, to clear Item 6 by 0930. Captain Ren Vassar was 71 years old. This was not information that appeared in the session record, but Kale had read her file, as he read all files for delegations appearing before the chamber, because knowing who was speaking was part of knowing how to document what was said. 31 years in Earth's diplomatic service. 6 years on the Boundary Commission. Retired into what her file described in dry administrative language as deliberate private capacity, which Kale had come to understand in the weeks before the session meant she had been waiting. She carried a travel thermos, military grade, scratched from use, the kind of object that survived wars not because it was remarkable but because it was built to keep working and be forgotten. She had brought it to the dais. She had set it on the table next to the chip. Her hands, resting over the chip, did not shake. Kale had made note of this. He made note of things that were small and off. The hands not shaking were small and off, in the way that mattered. Most people, appearing before 41 delegations in a chamber designed to enforce the posture of petitioners, showed the shaking in something. The jaw, the shoulder line, the index finger pressed a little too hard against the stylus or the table edge. Vassar showed none of it. Her expression was composed in a way Kale did not yet have language for, not calm exactly. Something closer to someone who has already seen the end of a story and is now only watching the middle catch up. He wrote delegate posture contained, effect unclear, hands still. Then he stopped, because she had just reached into her bag and produced a legacy reader. Kale looked at the reader, then at the chip, then at the reader again. She had brought her own. Archivist Commander Thelnaros of the Vorath Hegemony occupied the senior delegation chair 6 meters to the left of the dais, and had not moved since the session opened. He was crystalline spine, apex predator in his basic architecture, carrying himself with the absolute economy of motion that Kale associated with beings who had never been contradicted in a formal setting. His lateral plates bore silver filing marks, rank indicators. Kale knew, though the precise hierarchy they indicated was specific to the hegemony's internal structure. His eyes refracted light in the way of a species that had evolved for low-visibility hunting. He had been appointed to his position 28 years ago. The original architect of the Treaty of Kethsaron, the Grand Architect Vethnaren, Vorath Hegemony, who had argued for the treaty's existence through 11 full negotiation cycles, had retired 47 years before the current session. Thelnaros had been appointed to the Hegemony's senior accord position 19 years after Vethnaren left. There was a gap, in other words, of 19 years during which the man who built the institutional position and the man who now held it had no direct overlap. Kale had found this detail in the Hegemony's own personnel records, filed in the Accord's administrative registry 3 weeks before the session. He had not known at the time whether it mattered. He was beginning to think it mattered. Thelnaros was watching Vassar connect the legacy reader to the dais input terminal with the stillness of a being who has seen procedural inconveniences before and expects this to conclude as procedural inconveniences conclude, quickly, quietly, without altering the session's expected outcome. He had not yet looked at the chip closely. Yalaseth granted permission for Captain Vassar to address the chamber the way he granted permission for most items on a long agenda, with the economy of someone who had learned that acknowledgement was faster than objection. He said something brief in standard accord that Kale's notation system rendered as, "The chair recognizes the Earth delegation's representative. You may proceed." Vassar did not immediately proceed. She adjusted the legacy reader on the dais surface. A small movement, a millimeter of alignment, maybe 2, the kind of adjustment that hands make when they have done something many times before and know exactly what the mechanism requires. Then she straightened. Then she was still. Kale had his stylus positioned. He had his notation surface active. He had, as he always did, the session's agenda loaded on his secondary display. Item 6 of 11, expected duration 10 minutes, outcome anticipated, procedural review, dissolution confirmed, session continues. 3 of the 41 delegations were reading secondary materials. 1 appeared to be asleep. The chamber made the low ambient sounds it always made, the hum of translation matrix systems maintaining synchronization across 41 language architectures, the soft percussion of styluses on notation surfaces, the occasional shift of a delegation representative in a chair designed for a different body type than their own. Kale had learned to hear through these sounds, the way one learns to hear through any background one lives inside long enough. Vassar looked at the chip, then at the reader, then she spoke. "I would like," she said, in standard accord that the translation matrix rendered into 41 languages simultaneously, to read a document into the session record. Yalaseth, without looking up from his own notation, said, "Noted, proceed." It was, Kale would later reflect, the most significant permission ever granted by accident. What appeared on the shared display, the wideband projection surface that spanned the upper third of the chamber's rear wall, visible from every delegation position, was not what anyone in the room had expected. It was not a legal brief. It was not a counterfiling or a challenge to the hegemony's procedural documentation or a motion to suspend the dissolution review. It was not formatted in any current Accord template. It was handwriting, actual handwriting, digitized from the original physical medium, the cursive loops of a script that the translation matrix's header identified, after a half-second of processing delay, as Vorath Standard Ceremonial Script, Archival Format, Session Document, Treaty of Keth Saron Foundation, Year 2633 Accord Standard, 214 years old. The header continued, Session 7, Grand Architect Vethnaren Vorath Hegemony, Lead Architect Atmospheric Sovereignty Compact. Kale's stylus stopped. Not paused, stopped. The partial character he had been forming, the notation for document introduced, category, supplementary evidence, remained incomplete on his surface. A single open stroke that he did not close for the next 40 seconds, though he did not realize this until later. He was looking at the display. He was looking at handwriting that was 214 years old, written by the Vorath Hegemony's own lead architect, preserved in the format that the Earth delegation had maintained, had apparently been maintaining, in their Sector 7 archive, for the entire duration of the treaty's existence. The treaty, the Vorath Hegemony, had dissolved 17 months ago. The treaty whose dissolution had been filed in a location no Earth delegation had ever been told to access. Kale thought they knew they were going to need this. Then he thought, no, they kept it because they always knew they might. Thelnaros made his first procedural objection at 09:17. He did not rise. He activated his delegation's floor indicator, a small amber light that signaled intent to speak. And when Yalaseth acknowledged it with a brief look, Thelnaros said, in the formal register he used for all chamber speech, that the document being displayed was outside the scope of the current session's review parameters, as the session had been convened under current charter provisions and supplementary historical documents required separate filing for admission under Protocol 14 Gamma. He said this in 43 words. Yalaseth said in 6, the chair finds it admissible. Continue. Thelnaros went still. Not the ordinary stillness he carried throughout the session, the stillness of a being managing a situation it has seen before. This was a different stillness. Kale registered it the way he registered the hands not shaking, as something small and specific that did not fit the expected pattern. Thelnaros's crystalline plates, which had been catching the chamber's overhead light in the smooth angles of a being at rest, now caught it in fractured intervals. A very small change, the kind that would not appear in any record, except Kale's margin notation. He wrote it anyway. Vassar began to read at 09:18. She did not announce the document. She did not explain its significance. She did not look up from the text to check whether the chamber was paying attention. She read at a pace that Kale's notation system registered as measured, not slow, not hurried, in the steady rhythm of someone who has read this text before and knows how long it takes to reach the parts that matter. Vethnaren had written in the formal Vorath ceremonial style, which the translation matrix's real-time rendering converted into standard Accord prose. This meant the words that appeared in Kale's earpiece. The words 41 translation systems were simultaneously distributing across the chamber, were Veth Naren's words in structure and meaning, carried by Vassar's voice. At minute 1, the chamber listened with the attention of routine procedure. The 3 delegates with secondary materials continued reading them. The delegate who had appeared to be asleep remained in the same position. Kale took his notes. At minute 2, Yalaseth stopped looking at his session notes. Kale did not write this down immediately. He noted it afterward in the margin, because at the time he was listening to what Vassar was reading. Veth Naren was describing, in the formal register of a civilization arguing before a body it hoped to persuade, why the atmosphere of a world was not a territorial resource, why it was not a substrate for dispersal testing, why it was not a variable in any sovereign calculation that deserved the name. He used the word dignity 7 times in the first 2 pages. He used the phrase fundamental condition of existence 4 times. He had been, the header noted, 31 sessions into a negotiation that had lasted 11 full cycles. He had been, in other words, patient. She set the chip down, she folded her hands, she waited. Kale realized he had stopped writing again. He looked at his stylus. He started again. At minute 3, the 3 delegates with secondary materials put them down. Not to the side, down, face down on the desk surface, in the way one sets things down when the thing one is doing has become less important than what one is hearing. Kale registered the gesture. He registered also that the delegate who had appeared to be asleep was now visibly not asleep, and had been, he thought, not asleep for at least the past 90 seconds, though he could not determine precisely when the change had occurred. He wrote status of chamber attention, shifted, all delegations now attending, timing of full attention shift, uncertain. What he did not write, not in the official record, not yet, was what he was thinking. What he was thinking was that he had been filing documents in this chamber for 13 months, and he had never once considered that a document could be a weapon, not a legal brief, not a countermotion, a document, words spoken 2 centuries ago by the same civilization now arguing for their opposite, preserved by the civilization that had the most to lose from forgetting. At the 4-minute mark, Vassar reached the passage. Kale knew it was the passage because Thelnaros moved. Not much. Not in any way that would appear on the official visual record, because the official visual record tracked the dais speaker and the primary delegation chairs, and what Thelnaros did was not a gesture, it was the absence of one. His lateral plates, which had been making the fractured light catch Kale had noted earlier, went completely still. His spine alignment changed by perhaps 2 degrees. His eyes, which had been tracking the display with the focused attention of a senior official following an argument he expected to counter, stopped tracking. They were fixed. On the display, on Veth Naren's handwriting, on the words. Kale did the calculation he had been doing in pieces for the last 4 minutes. Thelnaros had been appointed 28 years ago. Veth Naren had retired 47 years ago. The gap was 19 years. During those 19 years, the hegemony had held the accord position, had continued to participate in sessions, had continued to file documents, had continued to maintain the treaty without the man who built it, without, apparently, anyone who had read the foundational sessions, without anyone who had held the original session transcripts and understood what had been promised, and why, and by whom. The dissolution had not been a betrayal of Veth Naren's work. It had been, Kale now understood, an act of forgetting, a filing error disguised as strategy, a civilization that had stopped knowing what it had agreed to because the person who agreed to it was gone, and nobody had thought to ask why he had agreed. Vassar read the last lines of the passage. Veth Naren, in year 2633, in session 7 of 11 negotiation cycles, in the formal Vorath ceremonial script, had written, "Atmospheric sovereignty is not a territorial question. It is a question of what we owe to every being that breathes the air of a world we claim to govern. Any civilization operating under principles of sentient rights cannot, in good conscience, do otherwise. I have argued this for 11 cycles. I will argue it for 11 more. We are building something that will outlast all of us." He had been very persuasive. The chamber was quiet in the way that large rooms with 41 occupants and active translation systems are not supposed to be quiet. A delegate near the back, one of the three who had been reviewing secondary materials, set a stylus down on the desk. The sound was small and sharp and audible. Kale's hand was still. Vassar finished reading. She removed the chip from the reader with the same 2-degree adjustment she had used to seat it. She set it in her palm. She looked up at the chamber, because the geometry of the room demanded it, because the dais was 6 steps below floor level, and the 41 delegations were arranged in a half-circle above her. And she was quiet for a moment that Kale counted, automatically, the way he counted everything in this room. 3 seconds. Then she spoke. Grand Architect Veth Naren argued for this covenant for 11 cycles, she said. He was very persuasive. We agreed with him completely. She paused. The pause lasted 2 seconds. We still do. The chamber had not moved. That was the thing Kale kept returning to later, when he tried to write down what those final 2 seconds felt like before the room understood what had happened. 41 delegations. Translation system still running. The ambient hum of the chamber's mechanical life still present beneath everything, and yet the room had the quality of a held breath, the specific silence of a large space in which everyone has stopped doing what they were doing at the same moment, without anyone giving a signal. Vassar had said, "We still do." She had not waited for a response. She sat. And then this was the part Kale could not immediately record, because his hand was not moving. She reached into the front pocket of her coat and produced the travel thermos. The scratched one. The military-grade one that had been sitting on the dais table since the session opened, and that Kale had logged in his initial equipment notation as personal beverage container, no accord significance, and had not thought about again until this moment. She poured a cup. The sound of liquid moving from one container to another, small, warm, domestic, was the only sound in the chamber for the next 4 seconds. Kale counted 4 seconds before someone moved. He counted because counting was what he did in this room, and because he did not know what else to do with his hands while his stylus was still and his notation surface was waiting. The someone who moved was not Thelnaros. It was the delegate who had been reviewing secondary materials near the back of the chamber, the one who had, somewhere in the past few minutes, set them face down on the desk surface. He did not stand. He did not speak. He turned very slightly in his chair to look at the Vorath delegation table. Kale had 7 seconds before the session formally continued, and he used them to do what he had been trained to do. He wrote down what he saw. What he saw was this: 41 delegations, none of whom were doing anything except looking at the dais, or at the Vorath delegation table, or at the display, which still showed the header of Veth Naren's session document, the handwriting visible in the background behind the translation header, the date still legible, year 2633, Session 7, Treaty of Keth-Saron Foundation, as if the document itself was waiting to be dismissed. What he saw was Thelnaros. Thelnaros had not moved. His spine alignment had not changed since the moment Vassar reached the core passage. His crystalline plates were still. His eyes, which had stopped tracking the display several minutes ago and had not resumed, were fixed on the dais table, on Vassar's hands, on the thermos. Kale wrote, Vorath Senior Delegate Thelnaros, posture unchanged from minute 4, no countermotion activated, no floor indicator lit, no communication with secondary delegation staff. Then he wrote in his margin in his own script, he has not moved because he does not know what to do. This is new. Presiding Officer Yalaseth spoke at 0924. He said, the chair acknowledges the Earth delegation submission. The chair notes the document's archival origin and its formal admission to the session record. The chair calls for a procedural recess of. He stopped. This was unusual. Yalaseth did not stop mid-sentence. In 19 years of running these sessions, Kale had been told by a senior core member on his second day, Yalaseth had never called a recess that he had not prescheduled. 20 minutes, Yalaseth finished. He closed his notation surface. The chamber began, very slowly, in the way of large institutional spaces that have been given permission to exhale, to move again. Translation systems dropped to standby. 2 delegations spoke quietly to their internal staff. 1 delegate, from a species Kale knew only as the Selari Compact, stood up and walked to the rear of the chamber and stood there, looking at nothing in particular. Thelnaros rose. He did not speak to his secondary staff. He did not activate any communication device. He stood for a moment at the Vorath delegation table, looking at it the way Kale had seen people look at things they needed to say something about but had not yet found the words for. Then he walked across the chamber floor. He walked to Vassar's table. Kale watched this from his station. He was, technically, still inside the chamber. The archival core rules were clear on this. A recess was not a session end. A recess was a pause in the record. What happened in a recess was not off-record. It was simply unscheduled, and unscheduled events were documented at the archivist's discretion. Kale kept his stylus in his hand. Thelnaros reached Vassar's table. He stood at the edge of it, not across from her, not confronting her, but at the corner, as if he had approached and then found the exact spot to stop and had stopped there. He looked at the table's surface. The thermos was there. The legacy reader was there. The chip was in Vassar's hand or her pocket. Kale could not see it. Thelnaros was quiet for a long moment. Vassar poured a second cup. She did not look up. Thelnaros looked at the table's surface. And then, this was the moment Kale's stylus resumed. He spoke. Not in standard accord. In what Kale's translation system identified, with the small uncertain pause that indicated a dialect it had not processed recently, as Vorath sub-register, formal intimate, a register used between members of the same institutional house when the formal register would be dishonest. The translation came through approximately 3 seconds later. I did not know he said that. 5 words. Vassar looked up at him. Her expression was the one Kale had been trying to classify since the session opened, the one that was not calm, exactly. Looking at it now from his station, with the context of the past 45 minutes behind it, Kale thought he understood it a little better. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for this sentence for a very long time. She said nothing. She did not need to. Thelnaros stood at the corner of Vassar's table for another moment. He did not move his hands. He did not look away from the table. Then he said, still in the sub-register, still in the dialect his translation system was working to keep up with. He was our best one. He believed in the things he argued for. I was told he was. He stopped. He appeared, Kale noted, to be deciding something. Then he said, I was given his position. I was not given his reading list. Vassar's hands, around the thermos, were still. She said in standard accord in the flat economy of her normal speech, No, you weren't. That was all. Thelnaros stood for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and he walked back across the chamber floor and he sat at the Vorath delegation table and he activated his secondary display and he began. Kale could see the screen angle from his station reading, not the session agenda, something longer, something that required scrolling back to the beginning. Kale wrote in his margin, Vorath Senior Delegate accessing Hegemony historical records. Session 7 of Founding Negotiations visible on secondary screen. Timestamp on file, year 2633. He read for the next 17 minutes. Nobody interrupted him. What had happened to Earth's atmosphere was not a small thing. Kale had known this, in the abstract, for the 13 months he had been filing documents about it. He had known it the way one knows the facts of a distant event, accurately, completely, and without the weight that comes from standing near something. Standing near it now, with the recess emptying the chamber around him and the session record still open on his notation surface, he let himself know it differently. Twice in 16 months, the Vorath Hegemony had conducted atmospheric dispersal events in Earth's upper air. The compounds used had been described as biologically inert to carbon-based life. The description had been filed in the same annexes as the dissolution, in the same procedural registers that no Earth delegation had been told to access. Earth's scientific community had disputed the inert characterization. The dispute had been logged in the official records margin section. The margin section, where Kale himself was writing, right now, the things he did not know how to put in the official version. He thought about what biologically inert meant as a category. He thought about the beings on Earth, 7 billion of them, by the last population count he had filed, who breathed the air of their world without knowing it had been a subject of procedural dispute in a chamber they had never seen. He thought about what it meant to file a complaint in the margin of an official record, about how long something could live in a margin before someone decided to read it. He thought about Veth Naren, who had argued for 11 cycles, in a room like this one, in a script that was no longer used. He argued, he persuaded, he built it into law, and then he retired, and the institution went on without him. And somewhere in the 19 years between his retirement and the appointment of his successor, the thing he had built was filed, slowly, into the section of the archive labeled Foundational Precedent, which was the section that busy officials cited without reading, and that patient ones preserved for exactly this kind of mourning. Yalaseth returned to the chamber at 09:44 and called the session back to order. He did not look at the Vorath delegation table for longer than standard procedural sweep. He did not comment on the preceding submission. He called item 6 of 11 and asked for a motion. The motion came from a delegation near the center of the chamber, the Vorathi Union, whose representative had been one of the 3 reviewing secondary materials when the session opened. She stood, stated the motion in 2 sentences, and sat. The motion was to invalidate the procedural dissolution of the Treaty of Kethsaron, filed under Procedural Annex 7 Theta, on the grounds that the founding session records, admitted to the official record at 09:18 by the Earth delegation, demonstrated that the original treaty signatory had not dissolved the treaty. The original signatory had, in fact, argued against its dissolution in language that the Vorath Hegemony's own procedural charter identified as binding precedent. The Vorath Hegemony's charter, Thelnaros had built the dissolution argument on it. Thelnaros's secondary display, still showing Session 7 of the founding negotiations, was dark when the motion was called. He had closed it. He did not object to the motion. Kale noted this. He noted it in the official record and then, 1 line below in the margin, no objection raised, no procedural counter, no floor indicator activated. First session in 13 months in which the Vorath senior delegate has not filed a procedural objection. The vote was not unanimous. Not clean, not without dissent. 3 delegations abstained, the Hesari Collective, the Marin Sovereignty, and a block of 2 smaller systems that Kale knew had long-standing Vorath trade agreements, and had been watching the hegemony's territorial expansion with the careful attention of those who have decided, for now, that watching is safer than acting. 1 delegation voted to retain the dissolution. Kale logged the name in the official record. He did not write in the margin what he thought of it. That was not his role. But the vote carried. Not unanimous, not clean, but it carried. The Treaty of Kethsaron was restored. Earth's atmospheric sovereignty was re-established. The procedural annex under which the dissolution had been filed was flagged for independent review, which meant that the mechanism the Vorath Hegemony had used to file the dissolution without notification would now be examined by a review body that reported to the full Accord membership rather than to the Hegemony's procedural office. The thing built to protect the Vorath Hegemony's interest had become the instrument of its review. Kale wrote item 6 of 11, resolved, session continues. He stopped, he looked at what he had written. Then, in the margin, I thought I was recording a procedural outcome. I was recording what happens when a civilization decides that what it built cannot be used against it, and then learns that it can. The chamber's laugh came 15 minutes later, during item 8. It was not a planned laugh. It was not in response to anything humorous in item 8, which concerned a minor boundary recalibration in a sector Kale had never visited and had no particular feeling about. What happened was that a delegate, one of the 3 who had been reviewing secondary materials, not the one who had moved them face down but one of the others, said something quietly to the colleague beside him, and the colleague made a sound, and the sound was the kind that spreads in large rooms when the tension in the room has broken, and everyone is aware, at the same moment, that the thing they were all thinking has just been said aloud. The official session record would describe it as brief procedural commentary from the Celari Compact delegation. Kale knew what it was. It was the sound of 41 delegations recognizing, at the same time, that they had been sitting in a room with the answer to a 200-year problem, and had been waiting for the party that kept it to come and read it out loud. It was the sound of an institution realizing that the thing it thought was over had been over for 214 years, preserved by the people who had the most to lose from forgetting. It was the sound of shame that has no other outlet except the one that sounds, from the outside, like amusement. Not unanimous, not clean, not joyful. But it carried. Vassar had gone by the time item 9 was called. Her delegation had filed the standard session exit form, time 10:07, which was before the vote was formally recorded, which meant she had left either during the vote count or in the moments immediately after, while the tally was still being processed. Cale had not seen her leave. He had been writing. Her table was empty when he looked up. Not completely empty. The legacy reader was gone. The chip was gone. Her bag was gone. Her coat was gone. What remained was the thermos. It sat at the center of the dais table, lid on, still warm. He knew it was still warm because he could see, faintly, the condensation ring it had left on the dais surface. The kind that forms when something hot has been sitting in one place long enough to leave a mark. She had taken the chip. She had taken the document. She had taken the reader she had brought from Earth, and the case it came in, and whatever else she had carried into this chamber. She had left the thermos. Cale looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote in the official record, Earth Delegation, Exit Filed 10:07, Items Removed, Archival Chip, Legacy Reader, Personal Effects. Then in the margin, beneath everything else he had written that morning, she left the thermos. I don't know if this was deliberate or if she forgot it. I think it was deliberate. I think she knew the record would show what she brought. I think she wanted the record to show what she left. He paused with the stylus above the surface. Then he wrote one more line. What the chamber is left with, a restored treaty, a procedural annex under review, 3 abstentions, 1 dissent, and a thermos on an empty table, still warm, which is not going to appear in any official summary but which is the most honest record of what this morning cost and what it was worth. Item 9 was the re-establishment of a survey boundary in the Hesari neutral zone. Item 10 was a routine filing acknowledgement. Item 11 was a late submission from a delegation that had not been present at the start of the session. Yalaseth cleared all 3 in 22 minutes, which was faster than his average, though not by much. The session ended at 10:41 Standard Time. Cale filed the session record at 10:48. He marked it complete. He initialed the archival stamp. He did not reread what he had written in the margin. He did not have to. What happened after the session was filed as official record, procedural and unchanged. The Treaty of Kethsaron Restoration was logged in the Accord's primary registry within 6 hours. The Vorath Hegemony filed no immediate countermotion. The procedural annex review was assigned to a 3-body panel, scheduled to meet in 60 days. Earth's scientific community received formal notification of the atmospheric sovereignty restoration 12 hours after the vote. The notification was 3 paragraphs. It did not mention Captain Vassar's name, or Veth Naren's, or the data chip, or the 11 seconds of silence, or the thermos. Official records rarely do. Thelnoros did not return to the Vorath delegation table after Item 7. He had filed a delegation handover to his secondary representative, a standard procedural transfer, properly logged, at 10:12. His secondary representative handled items 9 through 11 without incident. Cale did not see where Thelnoros went. The chamber's visual record did not track non-speaking occupants. The official record showed only that the handover had been filed. What the official record would not show, because Cale wrote it only in the margin, was this. At 10:09, 2 minutes after Vassar's delegation exit form was timestamped, Cale had looked up from his notation surface and seen Thelnoros standing at the back of the chamber, near the rear wall, facing the display that still showed the session's documentation queue. The display that showed at the top of the queue the archival header for Veth Naren's document, year 2633, Session 7, Treaty of Kethsaron Foundation, Grand Architect Veth Naren. Thelnoros looked at it for 11 seconds. Kale counted, he always counted. Then Thelnaros walked out of the chamber, and the display cycled to the next item in the queue, and the chamber continued. 3 Accord historians would later cite Kale's margin notations in their accounts of the Keth-Saron restoration session. The first would describe the notations as the only honest record of what occurred. The second would quote the Thermos paragraph in full. The third, whose account became the standard reference, would describe Kale as a junior archivist who understood, in real time, that he was watching something older than the procedures he had been trained to record. Kale read this description 19 years later and thought it was approximately right, though not complete. What he had understood in that chamber was not just that something old was happening. What he had understood was that the chamber had not lost the argument. The chamber had never lost the argument. The argument had been won 214 years ago, in a room very much like this one, by a being named Veth Naren who believed that atmosphere was dignity and argued for 11 cycles until everyone else believed it too. The chamber had not lost the argument. It had only lost the right to forget it. And then a woman with a scratched thermos and a 214-year-old data chip had walked down 6 steps to a dais that was designed to make her look small, and she had read the argument back, in the voice of the man who first made it, and the chamber had been forced to remember. The session room was empty by 11:00. Kale was the last to leave, as he always was. The archival equipment required proper shutdown, and proper shutdown required time, and time was the thing this room had always had more of than its occupants. He powered down his notation surface. He closed the session file. He picked up his equipment case. He looked at the dais table one more time before he left. The thermos was still there. The condensation ring had dried. The faint circle it had left on the dais surface was barely visible, lighter than the surrounding material by a shade or two, the kind of mark that cleaning would remove by the next session. The thermos sat in the middle of it, lid on, handle turned outward, the way one leaves a thing for someone else to pick up. Kale did not pick it up. He turned off the chamber lights. He walked out.